Greetings everyone, Nate the Feral Painter here, and welcome to the first video of a series of videos that I'll be doing which covers the Deathguard Marines. In this video I'll be covering both the 40k and the classic 30k colour schemes, and as always I'll be covering a brush application and also an airbrush application. Stay tuned to the end of this video where I've got an important and exciting announcement to share with you all. With all that said, let's jump into the video. So to start with, we're going to start off by priming up our miniatures. I started with a black primer and then I came in and added some browns, and this was just to give it a sort of a rust undertone or a rust base coat, which will also act as some of our shadows. Again, anything you see on here we can achieve using some stippling and a dry brush, and if you want to check that out then please go ahead and check out this video which will teach you a little bit more around using that stippling technique. I will get into it a little bit more in this video because I do use a blend of airbrush and some stippling, which we'll get into a little bit later, and also I'll show you how we apply the classic Deathguard colour like the green one. I'll get into that a little bit later as well. If you are interested in airbrushing or looking at the market for an affordable airbrush that's also cheap and it's got everything you need right out of the box, then I highly recommend going over and checking out this video. But also Gallery did very kindly send me their flagship model as well, which is the Mobius 2.0, which is the airbrush that I'm using in this video. There'll also be a 10% discount code in the link in the description below, along with a discount code for any of you people that would like to pick these up from Amazon. So once you've got that brownish base coat down, or your rust tones, now we can start to add the first of our base coat colours. Again, you can do this doing some stippling, which we're going to move into a little bit later on, because I do really like the look of both when you blend both the scratchy stippling technique along with some airbrushing. I really like the look of that, but I'm only doing this now just to quickly get some base colours down and work out where my highlights are, and I'm just working my way around with that 0.2 needle and nozzle because it's got that finer work. I can move in closer, make areas brighter, and I've thinned the mix with 3 drops of thinner to every drop of paint, and this thinner mixture will just allow only a tiny little bit of that colour and highlight to show through, so that later on when I come into that stippling method with the same colour, not any additional highlights or anything like that, we can start to work up and get that mottled armour, like rusty awful effect. Now when I'm applying it, I'm almost doing it in a zenithal type. I'm calling it a zenithal, but it's not. It's a bit more angled down, but essentially I'm always angling my airbrush down, even though I do fire up sometimes into the more shadow or the harder to reach recesses. I'm almost doing it in a way that I'm always catching the topper or the higher parts of it, so like where the panels of the armor meet, it's always going to be in that rusty shadow tone, and this will just help a little bit later on in the process as though the armor is really battle worn and awful. But I'm just working my way around with this first initial base coat colour and that thinner mixture, just mapping out and sketching on with the airbrush some base tones or highlights if you want to call it that. After that has dried, this is where I'm now going to come in with some stippling. I've got myself a little shorter, smaller brush, and you can do this with bigger brushes, and I would recommend that, especially for the rust base tone if you're doing like some bigger areas, but just for some more controlled and where I can actually get in there with some detailed work. But that's why I've chosen the smaller brush, and I've got the exact same colour paint as I did with the airbrushing, and I've just thinned that 50-50 with water so it comes off the brush nice, and just very gently I'm working my way back round every single bit that I've just done and just applying it using this stippling method. And what that'll do, it'll break the armor up a little bit, and the more you look at it, if you add a couple of layers of this technique, obviously it's going to get brighter as you keep going up. This will just create layers upon layers of like mottling, especially with the Deathguard, as though it's infected or it's just gnarly, and it'll also give it that battle worn chipped paint effect, even if you know if the Deathguard do have paint and their armor is just not naturally awfully green. But just work your way around. You can dry brush some little areas that are like harder to reach, or just catch some of those raised edges. And then as a second highlight, or the final highlight stage, I'm going to add a tiny little bit of Ivory white to that mix. and then do repeat the same process again, but only targeting the brightest spot. So that'll be like the back of the leg, the top of the backpack, his head, and maybe some knees or areas on his stomach where that light's really going to be intense. So we're not applying it to, again, all over, we're just going to hit in those spots of the highlights. Now is a portion of the video where if you want to do the classic 40k scheme, so everything in this video is exactly the same, the colours, everything. The only colours that are going to change is the armour. So we've got the classic whitish, bonish, whitish colour for the 30k, and then I'm going to paint the shoulder pauldrons of those in the classic deathguard scheme, which is like the green, the 40k version. So if you want to do that and you want to follow along this tutorial, then these are the exact colours. So we're going to start off with a base, again stippled on using the castellan green, and then we're going to slowly add a little bit of deathguard green to that, and then finally come in with a final highlight of the deathguard green on its own, just in the brightest spots. And again, if you want to switch it up with the airbrush and copy what I've just done using those two colours, the same as the 30k colours, you can do that if you wish, or if you don't even have an airbrush, just follow along as I've done in this video using your preferred choice. But everything from the next point onwards, which includes all the armour trim and everything else, is literally using the same colour scheme. So now we can move on to the rest of the miniature. We're going to start with some chipping, and for this I know we've put that rust base coat down first, but I do want to add some additional chips to that armour, and for that I've just got some rhinox hide and some sponge chipping, and then we'll move on to a little bit of a stage after on with a brush. But a lot of people always ask me, oh, what's that sponge you're using, and what are you using to hold it? I'm literally just using I use any sponge. Most of the time it's what comes with the Forge World miniatures. That's a sponge that I've just got to hand. I've got that much of the packaging that I tend to use that just to get through it, but it always seems to stock up quicker than it does run out, which says a lot. And also, if you're interested in this stippling scheme, you don't always have to do it with a brush. You can do it with a sponge as well. But the best sponges, if you want to go out and buy a sponge, just go to your most easiest local supermarket or store and get a sponge. I think they're about $1, maybe even cheaper. You might get 3 for $1 or £1, and it's just a car sponge, what you'd wash your car with. Just grab one of those sponges, it'll last you almost a lifetime depending on how much stuff you're chipping, and they're just the cheapest and easiest. Just peel or break little bits off, rip parts off, put it into a clip or some tweezers or even just your fingers, dab it into the rhinox hide, dab it off on a cloth just so most of it's removed, and then very lightly start to apply it to the miniature. And I'm working my way around, making sure that I'm hitting the spots where he's got parts coming through or the armor's been ripped open. I'm going to put some more chips around there. On the lower half of the miniature as well is where I'm going to pay special attention, as these are areas that are naturally going to be worn down a little bit more than usual. Then after you've done and applied it with the chips, it does look good just on its own, but I like to come in with a brush just for some more finer controlled work, just to manipulate them, make some a little bit bigger or turn some into some scratches. But I just work my way around the miniature almost like in an edge highlighting, but not every single panel, and just adding some additional chips and scratches to the miniature. So all the silver portions, or the silver metallic areas on my deathguard were given again using that stippling motion or just some dry brushing, as it creates like these little microscopic little scratches and marks, which is brilliant for when you're doing silver or metallics. And what it'll also do if you dry brush and stipple it on, that initial brown base coat that we added very first at the beginning, it'll show through a little bit, giving the illusion of some more corrosion. But I used Iron Warriors first and then dry brushed a lighter silver over the top. And again, use your favorite silver recipe. You don't have to go out and buy all the colors that I've used in this. A lot of colors do have matches, but essentially all you need for the metallic silver areas is a darker silver and a lighter silver, and you're good to go. Now at this point, again, this is an optional step if you want to do it. I like to do it as I think it warms up that armor a little bit, and it also plays into everything being that little bit more rusty and corroded, as Nurgle's rot over time has just corroded that paint and that armor down to more of a rusty base coat-ish colour. But I've loaded up my airbrush with some Dark Oath Flesh contrast paint, and from it's like a reverse zenithal, so I tilt the miniature and I shoot upwards into the shadows, and this will just catch those shadow areas, giving it a slight filter that'll look more like the rust tones that we've just spoken about. And also, because I've got that 0.2 needle, I can come in a little bit closer with some more fine detailed work and just apply it to some of those more corroded areas. Again, if he's got like little holes going off near his stomach and stuff, that's where I apply it. Again, this is an optional step. If you're wanting to add this to your miniatures, if you've not got an airbrush, then simply water down some of that mix and glaze it onto those areas, or just tap it into some of the chipped armored areas, and that'll also give you that rust illusion. That is an optional step. You don't have to do it, but it's one I like to add as it deepens those shadows and also pushes everything into that rust tone. Now we're just going to base coat out and paint the rest of the little details onto the miniature before we move on to like the trim and the weathering and stuff. And for the fleshy like tentacle sections on the miniature, I've used these two colours. Started off with a base, added a little bit of the highlight colour, a little bit more, and then the final highlight on its own. Just applying it in a haphazard way. I'm not trying to be too neat here or anything. I just sort of base coat it on. Then because I'm adding a little bit of paint to each highlight, for each highlight, I'm just adding a little bit more. You tend to get some smoother blends, and again, when I say in haphazardly, I'm not just like slapping it on. I'm just doing it in like a scratchy, sketchy style. I'm just sketching these on, and then the rest of the work, like the washes and stuff, it'll just sort everything out for me in a way. It's almost, I don't want to say it's a lazy way, it's just an easier technique to do if you've just got two colours rather than adding loads and loads of different colours. But once they're dry on the flesh parts, I came in with some Citadel washes like the Carrying Crimson and the Berserker Bloodshade, and I just gave each little area just a little wash just to push everything and add a little bit more grime and grit and some shadows to those flesh areas. Now for the bronzy goldish trim, for that I've started off with a base coat of Scale 75's Decayed Metal. It's a really nice colour, it dries matte, and it's the perfect base tone for the colours that we're trying to achieve. Now just like we did with the flesh, I'm only going to use one additional colour for the highlights, and that is Army Painter's True Brass. And again, I'm just adding a little bit, so it's like a 50-50 mix, and then the True Brass on its own. And I'm dry brushing these on to the armour sections, or again sketching them on to just add to that more mottled effects that we're trying to achieve throughout this miniature. Now at this point, just make sure you've base coated out or painted any additional details around the miniature depending on the sort of build that you've gone for. Just go in and paint any of the other details that you desire, and then at this point, once all that's done, we can then move on to my favoritist phase, which is the weathering. I've also purposely left out on this model his sword and the little bells on the back, as I'm going to be going into a rust recipe for these. I want these to be really highly rusted, but we'll get into that a little bit later on in the video. So the first stage of weathering is obviously a unifying wash of Villainy Inc.'s Goons Grime. And for those of you that have probably never used or know what the Villainy inks are, these are enamel based products specifically designed with the intention of the Grimdark world or Grimdark painting. And Villainy Inc.'s Goons Grime is the perfect blend for the deathguard. You know, it's got that sickly, like greenish brown undertone, which is perfect for adding just a unifying wash, you know, rather than using Agrax Earthshade and all that sort of stuff. Enamels are a lot different. They work completely different to what you would with your acrylic washes, and the beauty of enamels is that you can, once you've applied them, as you'll see in the video, I'm just haphazardly slapping it all over the miniature, then you can literally, once they've dried, reactivate them with some mineral spirits and pull that back off, and that's called the reductive technique. And I've also got some links to some videos that you'll find interesting if you want to learn more about these products and how they operate. We're essentially, rather than using water, we're going to be using mineral spirits. So I'll give my bottle a good shake. I offload some onto a dry palette. So with a dry palette, you can use something like a large Citadel base or a piece of glass, or even just go into your cupboard and just get some baking paper, and that'll also work as well. But I've applied this. I'm not thinning it at the first few stages. So for the more heavily weathered areas or the more like grimy areas, I'm just using it neat, and I'm just applying it straight away neat without any thinning, and then when I get towards the top or some areas where I don't want the grime to be too heavy, that's when I thin it 1-to-1 with mineral spirits. And you'll notice I'm using this flat brush, and I found that this brush just really helps me because I want everything to be streaky and awful, and everything's like dripping down from this model. That's the sort of look I wanted for this miniature, and that allows me, one, to apply it in a streaky and a downwards motion, but also during the cleanup phase. So once you've applied it to all your miniature, just slap it on, don't be worried about anything. Once I've done that and I've given it around 15 minutes to dry, or just use a blow dry to speed it up, I'm then going to come back in with a clean brush, just moisten slightly with mineral spirits, and then using that downward streaking motion again, that's when I'm going to pull it back off the miniature and manipulate that grime effect to where I need it to be. You can come in with a Q-tip. I do use a Q-tip throughout this video just to pull it off some of the heavier areas or areas where I don't want it to be. But I'm always coming back in with that flat brush or just a standard brush just to manipulate some of those streaks as though that grime has started to drip down the miniature. And once that's complete, give it around 15 minutes to dry before we move on to the next stage. Now this next step is just adding some contrast and some panel lining, or some pin washers as people like to call it, and this is just going to darken everything up, darken up those recesses. It's also going to add a little bit more grime to the miniature with the products that I'm using, and it's also just going to create that nice contrast and separation between those parts. Now I'm using Villainy Decrepit Filth. This is one of their new products from the Phase 2, so if you're lucky enough to pick up one of the tester kits, I know these are coming out very soon, but if you haven't got this product, then something like an oil paint like Abtalon 502 Smoke will work also perfectly for this step. But the reason I've chose the Decrepit Filth is because, very much like Villainy Goons Grime, it dries matte. It's got that slight granular texture effect to it as well, which is perfect for these miniatures, and it also dries in line, and it'll also mix, when you start putting it on, it'll mix a little bit with that Goons Grime, creating some more nicer variation across the grime. I've thinned it 1-to-1 with mineral spirits. I'm just using a small old brush with a fine little tip on it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but this will just allow you to be able to target those recess areas a little bit easier. And again, do not worry about any I don't want to call it overspray, but any little bits that like sort of come out of those lines, we're going to use them to our advantage. So once I've worked my way around and added those little pin washers or panel lines and done everything around it, all those little areas where it's maybe built up a little bit heavier or it's seeped out a little bit, I'm going to use that to my advantage. So I've got my brush just with a little bit of mineral spirits on. I'm going to pull it out of those recesses and add some additional streaks to the miniature. Give this around 15 to 20 minutes to fully dry before moving on to the next stages. Now for the rust elements on this miniature, I wanted rust to be quite prevalent, and I want this step to be something that's quite important to really stand out on this miniature. And for this I've used a couple of different products that's really going to help and enhance the look of the rust. So to start with, I've got some of the Army Painter's rust effects, and essentially if you've got any rust products that you'd use, you could use them as well. But the reason I've gone for the Army Painter ones, it does have a very slight granular texture to it. It's very much like Typhus Corrosion if you've ever used that in Citadel, but it's got those rust colours, and I've got a couple of different tones of that, and again I'm just stippling these onto the miniature, and because it's got that granular effect, that's going to help with the look of the rust. And I just get the bells and the sword, and if you want to apply this to some other sections of your miniature, if you want it to be really rusty, you can do that as well. And I've just stippled these on, and then immediately after that I'm going to come in with Dirty Downs Rust. This is a fantastic product. It's like magic in a bottle, and you can manipulate with water. You don't need no mineral spirits or anything. But I'm applying it to the miniature, just coating it all over in like a thin mix, and because we've got those oranger lighter tones underneath, it's going to make that rust look a little bit more prevalent. Now you can manipulate this with water, so if you want it to be a little bit lighter, you can just thin it a little bit with water, or just apply some water to it, and that'll just help create some variation in that rust. And if you want those to be darker, it's very simple. You just come in with a little bit more of the Dirty Downs Rust and apply it there. Now, whilst I do have the Dirty Downs rust out as well, even though I've applied it to the sword and the bells, I'm also going to apply it to areas like the chains and some of the armour sections where I want that rust to be a little bit more prevalent, like maybe on the lower half of his legs or a little bit further up where he's got some rust streaks coming out of the pustules that are bursting through his armour. And I'm just working my way around, just adding some little streaks or just stippling it on into some areas to add some additional corrosion and also tie in with the rest of that rust effect that we've done. Now, once we've completed all those weathering steps, there are some additional little things that we need to do to the model just to tie everything up, just neaten it up and fetch everything back. Because we've dulled it down quite a little bit, especially on the metallic elements like his trim and the silver, I just came back in with the colours that I'd previously used and just gave them a little bit of a dry brush over just to add some additional shine and more metallic, and it just adds a little bit more contrast and just makes everything pop that little bit more. Also, for the brassy trim, I've also added some weathering, some verdigris effects to that, and this is the Army Painter's verdigris, and I've thinned this right down with some water so it's more like a wash consistency, because I don't want it to be too strong. I just want it to be very subtle there and in the background, and just like we did with the pin washing, I'm just applying it around the bolts and also adding some little streaks of verdigris as well, and because it's that greenish tone, it's perfect for our deathguard Nurgle miniatures. Some additional steps and effects that you can add to the miniature. I got some oozing vomit from Army Painter. This again is a special effects paint and it dries really glossy. Don't go overboard with this step, as you know, I think it can take away from what it is that we're trying to create, especially in that Grimdark desaturated look. It can be quite strong, but it's quite nice just to add around some of the pustules and some drips. Again, just thin this a little bit with water. And then finally, the most important element to get a little bit of surface finish variation and some of those nice glossy effects. I've just come in with some gloss varnish, added some streaks to the miniature. I've also applied it around some of the little tentacles and the flesh effects, and overall this will just contrast really nice. Even though it's not a colour, it's going to add some additional layering and some visual interest to your model, because we've got that matte effect of the rust and the grime effects in the enamels that we've put on, and that's going to contrast nicely against the wet organic matter that's coming out of this deathguard miniature. But it's these sorts of little elements that I really like to think about when creating a miniature. Not just the overall effects with like some pustule drips and stuff, it's ways and products that I can apply to the miniature to get those surface finish variation, and it's just going to push it and lean it more into that grimdark look. It gives the model a ton of variation, not just in textures or colours, but also the finish of that surface, whether it's a matte surface, a more satin or a glossy wet look to it. And you know, if you do want to learn more about these effects and really dive into the deathguard, I'd highly recommend an amazing video that was done in a course over at the Grimdark Compendium by Dark Ages Workshop. It's one of my favourite courses over there, and again I'll leave a link to that in the description below if you want to learn more about these Grimdark techniques and effects. The last thing I'm going to do to this deathguard miniature is obviously paint his eyes or his eye lenses, and for this I went for like an orange glowing effect, and it's just a case of using a dark red, a very bright saturated orange, and then some white to add to that as a final little highlight, which will make them look glowing. Again, you could just go in there, paint them white, and use something like a contrast paint to also get a similar effect as well. And the last thing to do is paint the base, whatever basing scheme that you've gone for. And one little thing, one little addition I do like to add to my bases is some pigment powders, and I just brush and dab these onto the base itself, just give it that more dusty look, and then I brush up a little bit onto the legs as well. Now the basing, that's entirely up to you. I've got a few basing tutorials on this channel as well, so if you want some inspiration, then go and check them out as well. So that brings us to the first episode in the series. Like I said, there are some more coming. We'll be going more in depth in different ways that you can paint and apply to your deathguard. I think I'm going to do the Pox Walker next, so make sure you do hit that subscribe button. And for all my other lovely subscribers, I've got a ton of videos coming as well down the line. Naturally, I've got the Fulgrim model from the Emperor's Children that I'm currently still working on. He's a big boy, he's a beast, and it's going to be pretty much like my Lionel Johnson video. It's a really long format video where I go into depth of everything and show everything that I do on there and all that sort of good stuff. So if you are interested in that, make sure again that you are subscribed to not miss out on that video. So news time. As I said right at the beginning, I did have an announcement to make, and I'll do probably a separate video to this, announce a little bit more on where, you know, what's going on and this and other. But essentially I have been invited down to this year's UK Games Expo, so I'm going to be down there demonstrating the Grimdark style and the villainy inks. I'm going to be with the Element Games guys, so if you want to come and find me, if you want to meet me, just want to say hello and all that sort of stuff, I can't wait to meet some of you guys, and I hope some of you are going to be down there so I can just meet you guys, have a little chat with you and show you some cool stuff. So if you want to find me down there, I'll be somewhere around the Element Games booth. You'll not miss me. You know, we've got all little fancy stuff and banners and all that sort of stuff, and showing off the phase 2 and some of the models that I paint on this channel. I'm going to be fetching them down along with some of these deathguard and the other miniatures that I've painted on my channel. But really cool to see some of you guys, and I can't wait to see you. I'll be there all weekend. So if you are going to go and you do want to come and say hi, let me know in the comment section below if you are going to be there, and I can't wait to see you all there. So that brings us to the end of this video and this tutorial. Hope you've been able to take something from it and some inspiration and little ways that we can apply. Again, you can apply these paint schemes, colours and all that sort of stuff to any of your miniature painting. But until next time guys, I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and I will catch you in the next video.